the audience will see that we've already got a poll up on the screen to get some sentiment of what you think about what's happening in the global battery space. And then we'll pull this poll up again at the end and see whether the conversation that we've had throughout the next hour influences what we think is likely to happen over the coming years. We're waiting for one more panelist to be able to join us. She is based in China and has some internet fun problems to get around. So hopefully Summer will be able to join us in the next couple of minutes, but I'm conscious of time. So I think it makes sense for us to kick off this panel discussion today. Of course, why exactly have we chosen to talk about batteries? Well, when you think about batteries, you have to recognize that they're a vital part of the digital economy that we now all live in, but also this transition to low carbon economies. And so when you look at what China's doing, you can see that China are building a battery gigafactory almost every week. And then you compare that to the US, where a battery gigafactory is being built almost every 4 months, according to research from Benchmark Minerals. And so batteries, when they enable this transition to electric vehicles, they are powering our mobile phones and laptops, and also a key part of the infrastructure underneath the energy transition that we're going through right now. The fact that Chinese battery manufacturing giants like CATL and BYD are supplying the rest of the world alongside other Asian players means that Europe and US are far behind. And thankfully, they've recognized that they are far behind and are beginning to make big plans to catch up. And so today, with the help of our expert panel, we're going to dive into what it is that's brought China to this place, but also what's going to happen and what the global response is to the battery landscape that we have. So delighted to be joined by Tula, who's managing director at Sino Auto Insights, Summer Chen, who's a senior climate change consultant at ERM, Henry Sanderson, who's an executive editor at Benchmark Minerals, and Chang Che, who's the business editor at SupChina. We'll have plenty of time for a Q&A at the end, so very much welcome the audience to put your questions into the chat box as we're going along. Just to take a look and reflect at the poll that's been coming in, we can see that in terms of where we think China has where we think the biggest influence on global batteries race is, government and policy is being seen as one of the top ones, and also, of course, a combination of all of these different factors. And then in terms of where the opportunities are for global collaboration and how strong those are, we can see actually quite an even spread between all of the sentiments from very likely to unlikely. And thankfully, perhaps, we have no one that's super pessimistic saying that there won't be any sort of global cooperation going on. To kick off the conversation today, I'm going to hand over to Tu to kick us off. And I think the interesting thing that's worth discussing before we dive into the global nature of this is to look specifically at what China's done and China's battery landscape as it stands today, because they're both dominant in the demand side for batteries, but also in the supply side. So Tu, it'd be great if you could talk a bit more about China and their leading role in battery manufacturing, and also how that relates to electric vehicles as well.
Okay, sure. So China started on the electric vehicle journey in 2009, where they started subsidizing research and development. It was a three-pronged strategy, right? There was research and development, electric vehicles, charging infrastructure, and battery cell manufacturing. You fast forward, so it's been a consistent investment, over 60, 70 billion US dollars since 2009. And a catalyst for the electric vehicle uptake, I think, started in 2014 or 2015 when Tesla came over, started importing Model S's and Model X's, and then NIO's was established in 2017, and then XPeng and Li Auto, the companies that you're hearing about now. And fast forward to today, we are going to be over 3 million units in passenger vehicle sales. And there's products all over the place across different market segments. And so this consistent momentum building, despite COVID as well in 2019 and a bit of 2020. There was a small hiccup, but we're seeing the uptake for electric vehicle sales increase significantly, while surprisingly, the ICE vehicle sales, or internal combustion engine, petrol engine vehicles, decreased significantly as well. Some of that has to do with the chip shortage and some of the supply chain issues, but it's hard to say and corroborate across the board that there's a chip shortage when we're going to hit 3 million units of sales in 2021. So yeah, hopefully that gives people a good overview of what's going on today. So
yeah, no, super interesting. Summer, I know that you've also done a lot of work looking at battery manufacturing and the low carbon transition in China. So interested if you have other insights that you've gained from how they have enabled themselves to get a leading position in terms of battery manufacturing.
Yeah, I think China really taken the initiative to build battery capacity both at speed and also at scale. And if I can give you some numbers, just give you like a broad overview, big picture in terms of compare with Europe or US and how it's really leading the way. So for example, the gigafactory. So when we talk about gigafactories, kind of the super sized producers of those lithium iron battery cells. So in the past 10 years, well, actually, if you look at past years, single past year, it's already increased. The number of the big gigafactory in China has increased from 100 to 100. Sorry, yeah. So now I think there are like 181 in 2020 this year, and among those, like over 100, probably 130 are actually based in China. And among those, there's only like 10 in US and maybe 16 in Europe. So if you look at the numbers, those are quite impressive. And if you kind of factory in China, it takes like 1 week for China to build a gig factory, but for US, it probably takes 4 months. So I think that's how fast it actually is. And if you look like the company-wise, CATL, they've been kind of founded 10 years ago, and they don't really in the radar of the EV industry until 2015. But now they already kind of leading biggest battery producer of those lithium-ion batteries. So yeah, so I think that's quite a lot going on in the past 2 years or 3 years, and it's really leading the way.
Yeah. And obviously one other area in which is leading the way, which Chang, I know that you've looked into, is when we look further up the supply chain, all the way back to mining and the materials required for batteries and other types of electronics. What do you see in terms of the strategy that China is taking in order to lead the way there? Do you see that there's similarities across the whole supply chain? Or are there particular aspects of their approach in rare earth metals and other types of minerals that's worth noting?
Sorry, is that question directed to me? Sorry.
Yeah, to you, Chang.
Oh, sorry. Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to this panel, first of all. I just wanted to say that. And yeah, so I can talk a little bit about the upstream side. So first, it's important to know, as Tu said, that China has been thinking about the control of their battery manufacturing for a long time, a lot earlier than a lot of the other countries. And as a result, they have, pretty much over 50% of control in a lot of these minerals that what we call critical minerals. So rare earths, lithium, graphite, cobalt. I think it's important to realize that one of the reasons why this is a problem is because naturally we want to make sure that every country has their own supply of critical minerals, right? We don't want them to be dominated by one. Sorry, and can you repeat the question again?
So I was just asking for your thoughts on how they have managed to take that leading place, given that you're saying, that they they have that dominant position in rare earth metals. What is it that's enabled that?
So I'd be interested in, I'd also be interested in hearing what Henry has to say, but my sort of, my answer to that question is twofold. So the first is, you know, China has been thinking about energy security and making sure that they have control of certain, well, so in terms of rare earths is a little bit different. So let's put rare earths a little bit aside for now. China's been thinking about energy security for a very long time, and they have been much more open to industrial policy than other Western countries. The other reason is because for a long time, you know, these industries like mining were really, you know, labor intensive. They were very dirty. You know, it was a job that was not, you know, extremely attractive to the middle class sensibilities of Western countries. So in, you know, in the 90s and in the early 2000s, a lot of these jobs moved to China. With respect to rare earths, so just the relationship between rare earths and batteries is a little bit complex, but it's important to just note that rare earths is a major component in electric vehicles. And you know, there's a similar process that happened with rare earths. Rare earths is a very difficult and dirty mining industry, and China was just open for business in the early 2000s, whereas a lot of Western countries were not willing to, or you know, a lot of the big key decision makers were just sending a lot of their factories to China.
Yeah. No, I think that offshoring point's really interesting. Henry, do you have anything to add in terms of what you think has enabled China to take a leading role on that mining part of the supply chain? And also, maybe, I know that you've spent a lot of time actually on the ground reporting on what's going on at mine sites, so it would be interesting if you could add some color on that as well. Oh, you're on mute, Henry.
So it's really interesting because what I think happened in China is they've moved up the value chain. If you look at the battery side, CATL, BYD, they both have their roots in making cheap mobile batteries for mobile phones and smartphones in the late 90s, early 2000s, and then moving up into EVs. But a similar thing happened on the sort of raw materials side, which is China's not blessed with loads of lithium or cobalt. It has rare earths, taking rare earths aside. So it really had to go outside of its borders to secure supplies of these metals. And what happened is a lot of this, interestingly, has been driven by private companies, private companies that started off in the dirty industry of processing these minerals, and then found they needed to secure supplies. So they went to the Congo, you know, they went to Australia to secure lithium. And it's very interesting, they're led by these generation who grew up, you know, post 1949, were born like in the early 50s. You know, their education was interrupted, and they're very entrepreneurial, sort of tough people. And they've sort of went overseas and secured cobalt mines in the Congo, secured lithium in Australia. And where China really dominates is the sort of processing of these minerals in China. So, you know, they contain, you know, they have a share of, you know, over 90% of lithium processing, for example, and it's similar in cobalt. So what China did was, you know, secured more of the raw materials in countries outside of its borders, but really dominated processing in China. So what's the impact of that? Is that China becomes like a massive clearinghouse where all the supply chains feed into China. So even though you might have a Western mining company mining cobalt in the Congo, it'll be sent to China to be refined. And that's critical because once it's in China, you know, then the next step of the supply chain's in China, and then it gets turned into a battery in China. So China really sort of has this huge mega presence in the supply chain because of this. And going back to what you see on the ground, I mean, it is interesting because in somewhere like the Congo, you know, the most successful operators have been these private companies that I talk about. And you've had the sort of big state-owned companies sign big deals, you know, 5 or 10 years ago that had loads of publicity, but actually they haven't been very successful. And what has been successful is small private companies that have come to the Congo. Like Huayo Cobalt is a classic example, you know, biggest producer of cobalt in the world, started off as a very small private company, again, led by someone who who education was interrupted, you know, in China. So yeah, that's the sort of way I see it.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think also interesting to understand that history when we think of kind of, okay, where are we now and what's going to happen next? Because we have seen that over the last couple of years, there's been a lot more business recognition of China's dominance and strategic shifts in what's happening from a business perspective, but also from a policy and regulation perspective, a lot of money going in to create a more of a global, more even playing field, if you like. Henry, I'd be interested just on the back of your comments there when you were kind of talking about what's going, the dominance of these Chinese players the whole way across the supply chain, how you see that shifting over the coming couple of years or longer with other players outside of China trying to gain more control over their supply chains.
It's actually been really fascinating because the last few years, you know, the global market's open, right? Anyone can go buy a lithium asset in Argentina. Anyone can go buy a lithium in Australia. But the really fascinating thing is we've seen Chinese companies be the most active. You know, they bought Congo's like biggest copper and cobalt mine. They bought, you know, lithium in Argentina, you know, and that opportunity has been open to all these Western companies. And for some reason, we just haven't seen Western companies act quick enough or deploy enough capital into these opportunities. So they're really quite behind. And I think the interesting thing here is that the Chinese stock market has enabled, you know, it's quite interesting, loads of capital to be deployed quite quickly. And you look at these valuations for, you know, not only CATL, which is now like the third biggest company in China, but these ones I talk about in the supply chain, like Ganfeng Lithium or Huayou Cobalt, they're massive, right? And they're deploying a lot of capital outside of these borders. And for some reason, the West, which had a good head start, has sort of lagged behind. Western lithium producers have lagged behind. I don't quite know why. They've just been more cautious about deploying capital and expanding. And I think for the West, that's the key question now. How do we scale up? You know, you need loads of capital, you need loads of commitment and ambition, right? And as I say, these Chinese private companies, you got to give them credit. They're pretty ambitious and they move pretty fast.
Yeah. Summer, given that you worked both in Asia, but also from the UK perspective at the FCO, have you also seen this dynamic of like, will Western companies respond and how are they responding? Or is it actually the opposite, that you have Chinese companies kind of continuing to build their dominance by going outside of China?
Yeah, I can see a trend that Chinese those battery manufacturers tend to kind of cross the border and to set up the factories in Europe, and quite ambitious to do that, like they've been doing at the moment. Like Evision has been kind of partner with Nissan to set up a gigafactory in Sunderland in the UK, which would generate, I think, 25 gigawatts hours capacity in terms of the size of the battery. So they've been doing a lot, and I feel like the whole rest of the world responds to China's kind of run up of the battery industry, and they tend to understand now. I think the Europe understand better than the US, because they already kind of trying to build up the supply chain for example, in the UK, because they don't want to really rely on China for a couple of reasons. I think a lot of countries feel the same way, and due to some geopolitics reasons. And it's important to understand some of the linked steps which Henry mentioned about the mining, the finding, how link those steps in the battery supply chain so that they can reduce the cost and improve the quality of the EVs. And also they launched a lot of policies to ban all the diesel, petrol cars, and so that they need to transfer to a more clean future. And that's something kind of the policy regulation would be the incentives for most of the European countries. But for China, actually, it's under the pressure of the air quality. So the intensives and drives are actually quite different. And I see a lot of government in Europe and US being talking about like trading deals, and whether that can reduce reliance on China as a single point in terms of the supply chain. So that's a kind of the trend I observe.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. And I think interesting definitely that we see that there is this ambition to more localize supply chains, both on a policy side, but also on a business side. But I think also when you actually look at the numbers that are going on behind it, you actually realize that there is still quite a large gap. I'd be interested, given all of the focus that you've had on looking at a Chinese automotive and their electric vehicle players, and also looking at those that are expanding abroad, whether you think that those expansions, what is the status of those expansions, and does that mean that actually this kind of narrative of we're localizing our supply chains and we're supporting local automotive, is that really happening in your opinion?
So, I'd like to take,
oh, sorry.
Is that for me or is that for?
Yeah, you take it too.
Okay, so let me take 2 steps back, because I'm just gonna be less polite than Henry. They got caught flat-footed. The EU and the United States got caught flat-footed, and the Chinese came in and basically ate their lunch when it comes to these raw materials, right? And the other thing that's happening is that the automotive industries for Europe, France, Germany, the United States, Japan, they didn't take the Chinese automotive sector very seriously until very recently, right? But if we look at where volume is, 55% of global sales volume around between 75 and 90 million cars a year are sold. 55%. So for instance, in 2020, China had 20 million, the United States has 17, EU had 15. So China is pushing forward with their agenda because these German car companies, French car companies, American car companies, their most important market is China. It's not Germany anymore. It's not the United States anymore. So they're finally acknowledging that, but it took them years and years and years to do that. And what we're seeing now is effectively the foreign automakers being forced to adopt electric vehicles before they were ready to, before their balance sheets were ready to, because these EV first companies, and we can say China's dominating, but the number one EV player in the world is a $1.2 trillion American company, right? And so the Chinese EV sector can thank Tesla a little bit for that, right? But we're also seeing products, because I think when you think of BYD, you think of these cars 10 years ago that weren't roadworthy in the EU or the United States, but now they're exporting the Han. You know, Herbert Diess, the global CEO of Volkswagen Group, he was test driving a P5 and he said, you know what, it's a worthy competitor. And so the Chinese learned big time. They're going to have challenges though, because there's going to be protectionism, and they wanted to enter the United States next, the NIOs, the Li Autos, the XPengs, the BYDs. But in 2018, the Trump administration put a 27.5% tariff on cars imported from China. And so they decided to go to the EU. But the EU is like Southeast Asia. It's a multitude of countries, cultures, and different marketing and different people. And so it's pretty complicated to grow a lot of share in the EU. You got to go country by country. And we're seeing the confidence from the Chinese EV makers, but they're still dipping a toe, right? Entering Norway, where there's 200,000 units of annual sales, that's more of a symbolic gesture than anything else, because now they can technically say they're international or global because they sold 10 cars in Norway. But, you know, long term, it's still going to take creating awareness of the brand, building trust with that brand, with Italian consumers, French consumers, German consumers. And we always have to remember that Tesla is an 18-year-old company. And I've said this in previous panels. There's 2 emotional buys in a person's life, a house and a car. So if in order for me to spend 40,000 euro on your product, I need to trust it. And so there's still going to be challenges for these Chinese EV makers, but they're well on their way, and they're not hesitant at all. They'll take the time, because we know, because we've been following China, that they'll just course correct until they get it right. So I'm jumping off my box now.
No, it's super interesting. Chang, I know that you've also done some coverage on China's electric vehicle players. Do you have anything that jumps to mind in terms of, even though there is the big Tesla sitting over there, are there interesting things that the China EV players are doing that are worth noting as being innovative or different?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just add two things. So the first is, it's also important to note that China just has a lot of electric vehicle companies. I think they have like
so hard to keep up with them. It's so hard to keep
so much. And why is that? Well, because it's not a totally invisible free market, right? So the government is really driving this home, and that might explain part of the kind of the ambition and the kind of force, because the government is really backing a lot of this stuff, and that's actually kind of created that's also kind of created some problems, because subsidies are a kind of double-edged sword. It produces a lot, and it helps build an infrastructure, but it also creates companies that aren't necessarily competitive in the global market. So the Tu was just talking about Norway, and NIO's had just recently announced that they were planning on expanding to, I think, 5 European countries, and so it's going to be a challenge. So the jury is still out on that. Another thing is, so the Tesla electric vehicle and sort of domestic electric vehicle comparisons. I mean, Tesla is still number one, and all of these companies are trying to essentially are gunning for Tesla. They're trying to beat Tesla, but I think it's what's striking to me as I've been sort of looking at the industry from China is that these companies are extremely innovative. They're not. We have this kind of like a bias when we look at Chinese companies. We think Alibaba just copies Amazon, or we think Tencent is Baidu copied Google, but in reality that was an earlier era, if that was even in an era. And the truth is, a lot of these companies, like NIO, they have their own business models. They have this really unique blend of AI, of smart EV technologies. They're working with other, startups in China that are, extremely technical. And these kinds of collaborations that you see on the ground is really quite remarkable. So I really think, we shouldn't count especially the big Chinese EVs out. They're going to be a force to be reckoned with in the future.
Yeah, and what do you think it?
Sorry, you go ahead. So just to piggyback off of that, they're building compelling products. That's the thing, right? Right. Because ultimately, it needs to be a compelling product, and that's what they're doing.
Yeah, and do you think there will come a point where they can build a more compelling product than Tesla, or do you have confidence that Tesla is also on that innovation trajectory to stay ahead of what all the other players are doing in China?
Well, I've learned to not to not forecast too much about what's going on with Tesla. They have this distortion. Them and Elon have this distortion force field around them. So anything bad that happens, I'm going to sell 100,000 fleet vehicles, but I turn into a $1 trillion company. And I'm going to sell, $5 billion worth of Tesla shares, and it goes up even higher. But what I will say is that XPeng is the first global mass market EV maker, Chinese or whatever, that is putting 2 LiDAR in a vehicle for less than $35,000. So they're bringing it. And guess what? The Volkswagen ID series, which is their EV series, sales are terrible. They're selling 4 of them. They think they sold 13,000 between the 4 last month. And XPeng alone sold 10,000 units or 11,000 units. BYD sold 80,000, 1,000 of those were BEVs. The others were plug-in hybrids in the China market. So, the other thing that's really important about the China market is that the average consumer of a NIO, of a Tesla, is much younger than the rest of the world. And these digital natives here in China, they fully embrace domestic brands because they grew up with Alibaba. That was cool, Tencent, WeChat. It wasn't like the generation before who always embraced foreign brands. And so I think that's another reason they're making these compelling products, because these young Chinese consumers are very open to the Chinese domestic brands that are innovating.
Yeah. And I think it's also interesting when you look outside of EVs as well, and you look at other applications of battery technology. Summer, I know that you've worked looking at energy infrastructure as well, so we'd be interested to hear your thoughts on in what other areas aside from electric vehicles and the application of batteries and mobility are we also seeing that battery technology is really thriving in China, and that there's a lot for us to be able to learn from what's going on in China.
Yeah, I do see a lot of opportunities to extend the battery kind of application beyond the auto industry, like with batteries in growing demand in other sectors like aerospace, aviation, electricity, like renewables, those wind, solar, storage, kind of intimate. So that's something I've been seeing being used in China quite a lot. And they've been kind of developing using the subsidy programs, which Chinese government can spending $60 million US on the subsidized all those battery projects. So I think that's kind of a big policy incentives to really stimulate this industry. And there's other oil companies. I see a lot of transition, like Total. They also been kind of doing some projects on. Well, they spend euros in the industry to build new battery plants in Europe. So I can see, there's quite a lot of opportunity in that area. And like hydrogen fuel cell is another area in China they've been looking at, and to see how it can apply in the city clusters, especially those aviation, heavy trucks industry. Quite a lot of going on.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. And I also think a lot of what you've said has touched on an interesting aspect of China is obviously around subsidies and government support. And when we compare that to outside of China, you see that only really in the last couple of years has that ramped up in Europe and more recently in the US. Henry, would be interested if you have thoughts on the role that policy plays in supporting the growth of the battery ecosystem.
Yeah, I was going to say energy storage is obviously going to be a huge market in China, because to meet their climate goals, to move away from coal, they obviously need to sort out the intermittency of renewable energy. And I think, the current situation of having these ultra high voltage lines transmitting renewables across China, I'm not sure that you can get all the way there with that. You're going to need energy storage. And on this point, there has been innovation in China. CATL has come up with a sodium ion battery, which is much cheaper, which could be used in energy storage, because you need the cheapest possible battery you can find, much cheaper than EV batteries. So I think policy wise, growth in energy storage is going to be hugely driven by policy, because we've seen in COP26, right, to fulfill these climate commitments, you need massive installations of renewables, and you can't do that without some sort of backup and storage. So I think that's one market where policy is going to be huge. And we're seeing also 5G in China. You need lithium batteries for infrastructure there. So there's all sorts of areas where you need batteries that you wouldn't necessarily think about.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. And I think on the policy front, are you seeing different approaches that Chinese policymakers have been taking versus US or European policymakers, or are they roughly all following similar suits and similar trends and similar timelines as well.
Interesting, because I feel like the EU a few years ago, the EU sort of saw what was going on in batteries and felt, well, we need to copy China in its own game. You know, we shouldn't be afraid of industrial policy and supporting this industry. And the EU have really gone out of their way to support the development of batteries. And they've helped support a homegrown champion, you know, which is called Northvolt, which is based in Sweden. And that's just received so much money. And I do think, you know, if you throw enough money at this problem, you're going to produce batteries, right? You need a lot of money. If you throw a lot, you're going to get there. I think the EU has been very, very successful in terms of corralling all the resources and focusing on this aim. So I'm actually quite hopeful about the EU. But I do think the US has been a little behind. And I think the US was slightly scarred by its experience after the financial crisis, where we saw a lot of government money going to back a whole load of battery startups, solar startups. They all ended up going bankrupt. And interestingly, a lot of them were bought by Chinese companies. Like A123 was this big battery success story after the financial crisis that went bankrupt. Chinese company bought it. So I think they're quite scarred by that. But we saw with this infrastructure deal that was passed last week, there's going to be $7 billion, which is going to go into the battery supply chain. And we're seeing, you know, Tu mentioned Tesla. I do think when we talk about the West, Tesla is a sort of exception. And I think they really understand the scale that's needed for batteries for EVs. And what we're seeing is loads of Tesla alumni who also understand the notion of scale, forming their own companies. And one in the US called Redwood Materials wants to establish a battery recycling, battery cathode manufacturing in the US. So Tesla is really the exception in terms of the West.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that you touch on Redwood Materials as well, because their approach, as I understand it, is to look at how can we improve the supply chain problems with electric vehicles, particularly looking at battery life is 8 to 10 years in a car. What do we do with those batteries when they get to end of life? And how do we make sure that the materials inside those batteries can be, well, firstly, whether those batteries can be put into other applications and second life applications, but also how do we recycle those materials? And that, of course, helps on the supply chain resource security question. But interested around your thoughts on kind of the circularity of the supply chains and innovations that are coming out like Redwood. Are those types of innovations, do you think they're going to make a big difference in terms of helping close the gap between what's been happening for so long in China and what's happening in the US?
Not in the short term. And this is where we've got to be careful, because I feel like a lot of EU government and US government talk about recycling a lot, but in a way I sort of see it on a policy level, a bit of a fig leaf. And it's because they don't want to invest in mining. No one wants a mine, live next to a mine in the US or Europe. So they see recycling as like the way for the West to overcome this, but it's not, because you've got such growth in EV demand in the next decade. Recycling is not going to make a dent, right? So eventually it will make a big difference, but in this massive growth spurt, you're going to need new mines, you're going to need new supply, right? Recycling is going to be, you know, way less than 20%. So Redwood is great what they're doing, but it's not the solution. You know, you do actually need to invest in new mines. Unfortunately, no one likes it, but that's the sort of reality.
Yeah. And Chang, I would be interested, I know that you've also looked a little bit around what are the new types of innovations happening and in the battery space and energy storage space, and what the implications are of this, because of course when we talk about batteries, the kind of default assumption often is that we're talking about lithium-ion batteries, but as Henry pointed out there's different types of cell chemistry, but also there's different types of ways of storing energy and energy storage technologies, whether that's hydrogen or other types of fuel cells. So Chang, would be interested if you have thoughts around what are the innovations that we are going to see that do really make a difference in terms of the battery technology itself.
So I guess the hottest new battery that's kind of, people are excited about is the solid state battery. And it's essentially, so the most popular that we use now is called the lithium ion battery. And solid state is basically the one of the components inside the battery. The anode is rather than a liquid, rather than a solute, it is just pure metal lithium. And it's the reason why people are excited about it is because it promises to have higher energy density, which means that cars can go on the road and you can drive it longer, which is a huge deal. It promised. I mean, so the biggest company at the moment is called QuantumScape, and it's an American company. It's multi-billion dollars, or at least I think 20 or 30 billion in market cap, and it's backed by Volkswagen. And they're based on their results, it seems that they have much higher energy densities. They have a lot longer cycle life, which means that you can keep charging. You can charge it many more times before it dies. There's a faster charge time. So a lot of the point about this is essentially that in the future we're looking at a world in which there may be multiple different other types of cell chemistries that have different specs. And what we'll likely see is some like formats inside the battery will be better suited for some applications. So I think Henry mentioned the sodium battery may be good for energy storage. And then there might be, solid state batteries might be good for electric vehicles and whatnot. But the interesting thing about this is that when you change the chemistry inside the battery, you completely change the supply chain. So if you win, if the future battery is, if QuantumScape's battery becomes the next big thing and Tesla decides to team up with QuantumScape and buys QuantumScape batteries, that's going to change the supply chain completely. And it's not going to be clear, and maybe we can talk about this in the future oriented questions, but I think that it's not clear, which country is going to be dominant in that. I mean, I think there will be still remnants that China will still play a part, but they may not play a major part in it.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Summer, do you have any other on the kind of the topic of innovation and what's happening next in battery technology? Do you have anything that you've seen that's really interesting, innovation that's happening on the ground that's going to completely change the way in which we talk about this question?
Yeah, I don't have much to add on, to be honest, on the technology wise, but I just want to kind of add on in terms of like the UK's positioning after 4.5 years Brexit, and that really impacted the whole investors' decision making because it's not certain. And so, but after the EU and UK have kind of landed on some trading relationship, I think really they kind of they just need to start from the scratch. And what is from scratch? They've been kind of investing money on the R&D side and building up all the battery testing hub in the UK. So in doing so, they want to attract those manufacturers or supply chains to the UK. So I think that's kind of the way they have to do it step by step, and that the L&D wise can be kind of a starting point to lead to the further implementation of supply chain and then the investment as well. So it kind of a long way to go. This is how I see it. And I think each country have different kind of strengths, and for Asian, like it's a more of a base of manufacturers, but for the Western, they're more of like they are the base of all the big car makers, auto companies. So usually they would be like joint venture between those Western-led auto company and the Asian-led battery manufacturers together as the emergence of the industry. But now I think they've been kind of looking at R&D more cutting edge research level, see whether they can attract some manufacturers or incubate some manufacturers in local, so they can kind of do it on their own, trying to lose like China's grip, maybe. I don't know. That's kind of what I see it.
Yeah, that's super interesting too. Do you have any insights on that R&D aspect from what the Chinese auto players are doing, or what auto players more broadly are doing to maintain their position, especially as Chang was mentioning, that these new potential battery technologies that come into place might completely revolutionize how we consider or talk about batteries in auto. So what from your perspective, what R&D is going on to stay at the front of that?
Well, I think we need to kind of broaden the scope a little bit, right? Because as we get more charging infrastructure, as we get more efficient on LFP batteries, for instance, Tesla with the 4680, that's not going to go in production probably until 2023. But I'm from Detroit, so I got to give a little shout out to this company called Our Next Energy that was just raised $25 million from Bill Gates' energy investment fund. They're trying to create a more efficient LFP battery, and as different ways to charge and battery swapping. So there's these different dimensions that could alleviate some of the demand on the fringe, anyways, at least, because to Chang's point, QuantumScape, that's the only play I feel that the United States has to gain back any leadership in battery cell manufacturing, but they're not forecasted to book any revenue until 2027. So that solid state stuff is still a pretty long way away. And if we're looking at battery swapping, there's a company in San Francisco called Ample. So there could be other options. And I think the EU and the United States, to a larger extent, needs to look at the lessons learned from China, and they need to be much more efficient with that $7 billion that's going to be invested in battery cell manufacturing. And they also need to support the GMs and the Fords who've recently announced huge investments in Tennessee and Ohio and Kentucky to build out capacity there with their partners. I think SK Innovation and LG, I want to say. But, there's going to be incremental innovation across these different things that support the battery cell that I think will also help. But, it's still going to be, for the foreseeable future, 80% of all future capacity globally is going to be invested in LFP batteries. And I think the most important thing, to Chang's point, is getting cobalt out, right? Because that's what effectively Elon's trying to do by moving to LFP, is get cobalt out, which is one of the more volatile and expensive rare earth materials in batteries currently. So
can I just quickly clarify one, just in case the audience doesn't know, LFP, and there's two types of cathode materials in the lithium ion battery. One is called LFP, the other is called NCM. NCM stands for nickel, cobalt, manganese. LFP stands for lithium iron phosphate. And lithium iron phosphate is a lot cheaper, but it doesn't have the sexy specs. It doesn't have super high energy density and whatnot. But now Tesla is switching to LFPs.
And I should add that BYD has a blade battery that uses LFP that's supposed to be much more efficient as well. And Ford is their first foreign customer in China. Ford recently launched the Mustang Mach-E, and it's not using the blade battery, but it's using the BYD battery cell. So they're expanding out even in China to foreign automakers. So.
Yeah, Sarah, I just want to follow up, which is on these excellent points by Chang and Tu, which is that, everyone expects like one breakthrough battery innovation that's just going to like wipe the floor clean. But I think there's going to be different technologies for different applications. And, we might see solid state going into luxury or premium vehicles where you need a lot of range. But Tu's right, that the more charging infrastructure you have, in most cities, people are not going to drive more than 200 miles, right? 200-mile range is fine, right? So you got to question, does everyone need this incredible solid state battery? Probably not. So I think it's not going to be one breakthrough that satisfies everything. There's going to be, LFP for mass vehicles and solid state perhaps for luxury and premium. And I think LFP is an example of Chinese innovation, which is an engineering innovation that BYD and CATL have done. which is, you're producing things at scale, you engineer them to be more cost effective, and that is innovation, so I think we can learn from that as well, right?
Yeah. What do you think the characteristics are of these companies that's enabled them to come up with these types of big innovations?
So I think CATL, they have huge R&D teams. They devote a lot of money into R&D, and BYD is the same. And the thing about batteries, and I think too, and Chang mentioned, is it takes a long time, right? First lithium ion was commercialized in 1991. It takes a long time to innovate and make these things at scale. And you see all sorts of announcements every day about some great new innovation, but can it work at scale, right? Can it be scaled up? I think the Chinese companies, it's quite impressive because they're operating at scale and they innovate at scale, right? So sodium ion, for instance, they've announced it, but they're going to scale it up rapidly, and that's what matters, right? Having something in a lab is great, but can you produce it at scale? What kind of yield can you have? You need to produce it perfectly every time, right? You can't have huge losses on your production lines. So all these things are super important.
Yeah. And do you think this scale is something that will be replicated in the US and Europe anytime soon? Or do you think the capacity for scale is something that is quite unique to these big players in China, like CATL and BYD?
No, it's coming in the Europe and the US. Volkswagen said it's going to build 6 gigafactories in Europe. And in the US, we've seen these announcements by Samsung SDI and LG. So yeah, it's definitely coming. It's the only way to get, transform the fleet to electric vehicles. You're going to need these gigafactories on every continent, right? That's the only way. So it's definitely coming.
Yeah. And so interested to Summer to hear your perspective on that question of like, when is innovation coming and how quickly is it coming? What do you see as the likelihood of this innovation ramping up to scale all across the world?
So when Elon Musk said there will be a gigafactory within the next 6 years, he said that in 2013 or something, but actually it comes earlier than that. So I would say, according to the net zero target, so this is what you see it, you set a target and you kind of figure out the pathway to achieve that target, and along the pathway it requires technology push that forward. So if we set a target 50 the petrol diesel costs by the selling of those cars by 2030, and then you need the technology probably between that 2030 to 2040 really to boost it up, because we've been talking a lot about peaking the carbon emissions in China, which is 2030, but we haven't really figured out the way how to drive that down. So the gap between 2030 to 2060, those are the kind of time require emerging technologies, including hydrogen, CCUS, and energy storage, and also battery storage. So I see that's the timeline we set for human beings, and that's a timeline we probably can meet it. Yeah, so to answer your question, I would say we have another 10 years to develop such technology and then deploy it at a larger scale in the next year after that. So that will be 2030 after that.
Yeah, super interesting. I see we've got an audience question coming in asking whether there's any rising star companies in the industry that you think will be worth watching for the future. I imagine Chang or Tu, you've maybe got some thoughts on the rising stars that you're seeing.
Well, I'd mentioned a couple. Ample, I think, is one worth looking out for. I think QuantumScape. I'm not saying they're rising stars. I'm saying they're companies to look out for. Sila Technologies, another Silicon Valley-based battery company. They're starting out with consumer products, so wearables. But I think they're eventually, most of these battery companies that are starting out in the consumer products, they're going to eventually head to electric vehicles. Yeah, and I think Northvolt is the green monster that's going to just dominate the European market. I think everybody's betting on them to kind of counterbalance CATL. So
Super interesting. Chang, do you have any other thoughts of companies that you've seen that are interesting? Maybe some Chinese ones that are interesting.
I got my pen, you know, let me know.
Well, so actually, I was going to say there's some Japanese companies. So I think SoftBank is a kind of wild card because they're also working on in the sort of battery space, and they recently just had like a battery showcase where they were showcasing a couple of the sort of Japanese batteries. So I think there's one called like 3Dum. But anyway, so I think, you know, take a look at SoftBank and the companies that they're investing in Japan, and don't count Japan out. They used to be the leader in batteries, if you know, not so long ago. There's another company that I thought was quite interesting, is another solid state battery company that's about to IPO called Solid Energy Systems, SES. They're backed by GM and Hyundai, and they also have backing from the Shanghai government. And they're planning on building a gigafactory in Shanghai. So I think, and then they have good products. I mean, they don't have a product, but they have good specs on their solid state batteries. So I think that's one to look out for. It's about to IPO.
Awesome. Yeah, I like that you kind of brought in, I think an important part of the conversation is often it's like, okay, China, and then what's the US and Europe doing, and actually recognizing that South Korea and Japan have a lot of important innovation and players here. Conscious of time, so I just want to offer you all a chance to kind of wrap up with one sentence on what do you see as by 2050, who will be winning the battery race? I'll start with you two. One sentence on your thoughts.
Battery race. I hope we're not using batteries by 2050. Let's just say that.
Amazing. Chang, what's your thoughts?
I think we already mentioned it, but I think that there's going to be many different nexuses of supply chains in different countries. And so it will be a kind of even playing field. China will have its own, US will have its own, maybe in collaboration with the Quad, you know, Japan, Australia. But it will be much more distributed than it is now.
Interesting. Summer, what's your thoughts?
We'll finish by one sentence. I think China is currently winning the game, the race, but I think Europe is beating US in the battery race with China's help.
Super interesting. And Henry, to no pressure is the final parting words.
Yeah, I think it's also what Chang said, it'll be a more multipolar world, right, where there will be just big supply chains on all these different continents. But I do think that geopolitics is not going to go away in the clean energy era. You know, we're not going to see an end to geopolitics over clean energy by any means.
Yeah. Super interesting. And so I'm just seeing the results of the poll coming in, and you'll be glad to know that what you're saying has in some way influenced people's responses. So we've moved from kind of a strong feeling that government and policy are going to drive a lot of these changes to now more of a recognition that it's a combination of all of the different influences, whether that's businesses, policy, or other kind of innovations. And then in terms of global cooperation, I think there's even more positive sentiment now that it's likely that we will see this global cooperation. And I think that is something that you've all been touching on, is even though there is this kind of geopolitical lens of we all want to have our own ability to dominate, there's also this interdependence that's there as well, and not going to go away. So I think that's a good place to finish, and many thanks to the panelists and also to the audience. We will now hand over for the next panel that's coming up.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.